The firelight flickered across the stone walls like memories trying to escape. Deep inside the royal chambers of Hotel St. Paul, silence pulsed like a second heartbeat, thick, unnatural, waiting to be shattered. The air reeked of tallow, rotting herbs, and the faint iron scent of something too fresh to name. Charles sat still in the corner, bare feet blackened with soot, his fingers twitching as if grasping at ghosts. The velvet drapes behind him danced on a breeze that did not exist. His eyes, once royal, once worshipped now, stared past the wall into a realm no one else could see. And then came the scream, not from his mouth, but from behind the locked door, where someone had not died quietly. The king did not flinch. He whispered to the floor, "They are full of snakes. The snakes wear my face." All around him smoke curled upwards, like the souls of those he'd forgotten. Outside, the city slept under frost. But inside these walls, a king had built his own inferno, and he was the last one left to burn in it. They told you Charles VI was just mad. A quaint madness like a child lost in fog. They said he forgot names, believed he was made of glass, wandered the halls, mistaking servants for shadows. They painted his decline as a footnote in the pageantry of France, the king who stumbled through delusion while nobles danced in his name. But they lied. They did not tell you that his mind cracked like a cathedral roof under centuries of strain. They did not tell you how he screamed for nights on end, his voice echoing through marble corridors like a curse, until even rats began to flee. They omitted the stench of his isolation, how for weeks he refused to bathe, dress, or speak, convinced his very skin was possessed. They do not tell you that those closest to him began locking their doors at night, or that the fire that consumed part of his private residence was no accident, but born of a frenzy no physician could cure. They said his illness was brief and unfortunate. What they left out was how he watched his own brother die by fire and never blinked. How he once ordered his knights executed in the courtyard not for treason, but because he believed their eyes whispered betrayal. How he believed the queen had been replaced with a demon and would beat the wall screaming her name until his fists broke. No one tells you that France burned not just because of war, but because its king had become a living mirror of its ruin. The myth is clean. The truth is ash. He was born on December the 3rd, 1368, the son of King Charles V of France and Joanna of Bourbon, wrapped in silk, prophecy, and pressure. They called him Charles the Beloved before he even knew the sound of his own name. The kingdom, still bleeding from the 100 Years' War, clung to his birth like a salve. Heir to a legacy of fragile victories and fractured nobility, he was the golden child meant to hold France together and the very flesh of a dynasty already fraying from within. From the start, there were cracks beneath the gold. Charles V, his father, ruled with intellect and caution, rebuilding after the humiliations of war. But even he feared what might come after him, not from enemies across the Channel, but from the poison already festering inside the royal blood. Joanna, Charles VI's mother, had begun to unravel by the time her son was born. Her mind slipped like a gown off the shoulders slowly, then suddenly. She wept at walls, she mumbled to shadows, and no one spoke of it aloud. Madness was not a wound in the house of Valois, it was a seed. At age 11, Charles VI was crowned king, a child wearing the weight of centuries. His coronation was held at Rheims, beneath soaring Gothic arches and smoke from 1,000 incense burners, watched by bishops who prayed he might be spared the fate of his blood. They called him the Well-Beloved, not for who he was, but for who they needed him to be. The regency was entrusted to his uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, Anjou, men more interested in coin than counsel. They plundered the treasury, divided France like scavengers pulling meat from a corpse, and left the boy king surrounded by masks. When Charles came of age, he dismissed them with fire in his chest. He sought justice, not tradition. He appointed men of lower birth but higher vision, notably the Marmousets, a group of reformers hated by the nobles but adored by a nation starving for change. For a moment France breathed again. Charles led military campaigns, restored financial order, and was hailed as a new kind of king, young, energetic, unshackled from the greedy lineage behind him. His people adored him. His court called him Charlemagne reborn. There were feasts, tournaments, poems sung in his honor that melted like honey across the continent. But all flames consumed themselves eventually. In 1392, the first fracture showed itself. It came during a military campaign in Brittany. One of his closest advisers, Olivier de Clisson, had survived an assassination attempt, and Charles, enraged and righteous, set out with his army to bring the traitor to justice. The summer heat pressed against their armor like suffocating cloth. Days dragged into weeks. The forest roads seemed to twist and mock. Charles hadn't slept well in nights. Whispers plagued him, dreams that crawled under his skin. Then in the forest of Le Mans, a barefoot man in white rags appeared from the trees, eyes wild, mouth foaming. He shrieked at the king, "Do not go further, you are betrayed." They beat the man, dragged him away, but the words stayed. Hours later, under the pounding sun, a knight dropped his lance. The clang echoed like thunder. Something inside Charles shattered. He drew his sword and screamed, "They are traitors! They are all traitors!" He turned on his own men, slashing and howling, until 4 had fallen and 10 more fled. He struck at shadows. He bled. He did not know his name. He collapsed in a fit, eyes rolled back, lips mumbling prayers to gods no longer worshipped. They carried him back like a broken saint. His armor was torn. His mind never returned the same. And from that day onward, France's golden boy became its ghost. The doctors called it melancholia. The priests called it a curse. The people whispered it was in the blood, some old sin passed from mother to son, from throne to grave. But none of them knew how to stop it. After the incident in Le Mans, Charles VI returned to Paris like a candle, walking in daylight, flickering, unsure, already halfway snuffed. The crown still rested on his head, but beneath it, the man was slipping. He began to forget faces, not just of enemies, but of those closest to him, his wife, his children, his friends. One day he would greet them with warmth and affection. The next he would scream at their touch, accusing them of sorcery, imposture, or treason. "You are not my queen," he once told Isabeau of Bavaria, his wife. "The queen was taken by demons in the night. You wear her skin." There were times he believed he was made of glass. He forbade anyone to touch him. He wrapped himself in iron rods sewn into his garments to prevent his body from shattering. Once he locked himself in a room for days, afraid a single breath might cause him to crack. The court played along, not out of kindness, but out of terror. Because behind the madness was a flicker of rage, and no one knew when it might spark into fire. Political control shifted to his uncles once more, most notably the Duke of Burgundy, a man who wore loyalty like perfume and betrayal like armor. France, meanwhile, fractured. Famine bled the countryside. England loomed like a vulture, and inside the palace the king played games with shadows. But it was not always chaos. There were moments brief, shining where Charles returned. He would speak clearly, rule wisely, love gently. These lucid intervals, as they were called, became the great hope of France, a hope that one day the king might awaken for good. But each return was shorter than the last, and the darkness that followed was deeper, crueler, and more erratic. In 1393, during a masquerade ball held to celebrate a royal wedding, Charles agreed to participate in a dance called La Danse des Sauvages, the Dance of the Wild Men. He and 5 companions dressed in flax and pitch, their bodies covered in combustible materials meant to resemble forest beasts. They danced like spirits through the candle-lit hall. Then someone brought in a torch. The room ignited. Flames licked across their bodies. Screams split the night. One dancer died instantly. Another dove into a vat of wine to survive. Charles survived because his aunt, the Duchess of Berry, shielded him beneath her skirts. His skin blistered. His breath came in rattled gasps. His eyes stared blank and hollow at the charred remains of his friends. And something behind them closed forever. After the fire, the court never spoke of the event again. It became a silent scar, a metaphor for the king himself, a man covered in fuel, waiting for a spark. The people still called him Charles the Beloved, but in private they began to call him something else, Charles the Mad. There was no scaffold, no executioner's blade, no crowd gathered to chant his name or spit at his broken frame, and yet Charles VI was executed not in a single moment but over decades. Death came not with steel, but in fragments, whisper by whisper, year by year, until the man who had once worn the crown like fire became a breathing corpse within its shadow. He began to forget his own name. Some days he believed he was St. George. Other days a simple peasant trapped in a palace of illusions. He spoke to chairs, accused paintings of treason, ordered punishments for crimes never committed. His servants learned to walk on silence. The Queen moved her residence elsewhere, raising their children away from the throne that had become a shrine to decay. In the royal chambers, time bent. The seasons changed, but Charles did not. He would sit by the hearth, whispering to the flames, repeating a single phrase, "They are inside the walls." When asked who, he would only smile, not with joy but with the vacancy of a man whose mind had become a cathedral echoing with screams. His body began to follow his mind into ruin. He stopped eating for days at a time, then demanded banquets in the middle of the night only to fling the food across the room, convinced it was poisoned. His skin turned pale, almost blue. His eyes grew sunken, shadowed by the weight of invisible torment. His once golden hair turned the colour of ash. And yet the doctors still bled him, still chanted their prayers, still said he could be saved. There were stories whispered through the court that the king had set fire to a child's room in the dead of night, believing it housed demons, that he'd chased his own son with a broken goblet, convinced the boy had stolen his face, that he'd stood naked in the courtyard for hours in winter, whispering to the stars, begging them to take him back. No one could prove these tales, but no one dared deny them. By 1405 he was confined entirely within his chambers, not by locks but by fear. The court had learned that madness is not merely illness but contagion. Those who lingered too long in his presence often left changed, hushed, unnerved. His gaze did something to people. It made them question the boundary between order and chaos, between self and shadow. France, meanwhile, split like a bone under too much pressure. The Burgundians and Armagnacs fought like starving wolves. His son, the future Charles VII, was exiled. His daughter was married off to the King of England, a political maneuver that felt less like diplomacy and more like surrender. Paris starved. Peasants revolted. The walls of the kingdom bled, and still the king muttered to no one. They called them attacks, episodes, but they were more like drowning, sudden and total. One moment he would be lucid, speaking softly to a page boy about the colour of lilies in spring. The next he would claw us at his throat, screaming about serpents. He tore his bedclothes to pieces, smeared the walls with ink and blood, laughed for hours, wept for days, and always, always the fire. He began to burn things, quietly in the night, first books, then portraits, then anything that bore the fleur-de-lis, convinced it was cursed. The palace staff stopped asking questions. They swept ash from the hallways like it was dust, and when the smoke got too thick, they opened windows and pretended it was incense. But fire does not forget its nature. One night in the year 1418, as Paris fell to the Burgundians, Charles disappeared from his chambers. The guards found him hours later, crouched in the crypt beneath Notre Dame, whispering to bones. "They are quieter than courtiers," he said. "They don't lie." He was not insane, not in the way they wrote it in books. He was something deeper. A vessel cracked so many times that light no longer reached inside. A man trapped in 1,000 mirrors, each one showing a different nightmare. In the final years he spoke little, he did not walk, he did not rage. He simply sat like a forgotten relic in a chair too large for his shrinking frame. When people came to see him, he stared at them without recognition. Once, when his own daughter wept at his side, he turned to a servant and asked, "Who let the ghost in?" In 1422, the bells of Paris tolled with sorrow. Charles Vic was dead, not by sword or fire or poison, but by memory, eroded, hollowed, reduced to silence. His body had long been in the palace, but the man, the king, had been gone for years. At his funeral, they dressed him in gold and blue. They painted his face. They called him the Beloved. They wept with duty, not grief, because they did not bury a king. They buried a warning. When the bells of Notre Dame rang for Charles VI, they echoed through a kingdom that no longer knew itself. The France he had once ruled, or rather once haunted, was now a land divided, eaten from within by wolves dressed in velvet. The war that had always lingered at the borders had seeped into the marrow of the state, and his death did not bring peace. It brought panic. It brought inheritance wrapped in blood. There was no moment of national mourning. The nobles bowed, the clergy wept, the commoners gossiped, but the air was not heavy with grief. It was heavy with calculation. Charles had died in name, but he had been gone in spirit for decades. His absence had become normal, his madness predictable. Now, with the shell finally buried, power was up for grabs. The Treaty of Troyes, signed during the waning years of his reign, had disinherited his own son, the Dauphin Charles VII, in favour of England's King Henry V, a bitter twist of politics birthed from the manipulations of Queen Isabeau and the pressures of Burgundian might. Charles VI had signed it while lucid, or so the parchment claimed. But few believed he had truly known what he was doing. Some say his hand was guided. Others say he believed he was signing a death sentence for the devil. Either way, the ink dried. Now, with Charles dead and Henry V also recently in the grave, a child Henry VI was proclaimed King of France and England, a babe in arms, a puppet with a crown, and suddenly the country was split again, not just in bloodlines, but in soul. Paris belonged to the English. The North bowed to Lancaster. The South rallied behind the exiled Dauphin. It was not unity that followed Charles VI's death. It was fracture. France cracked like a mirror dropped from a tower, and each shard reflected a different nightmare. the court of Charles VII, holed up in Bourges, tried to paint the death of his father as a liberation. The mad king was gone, the shadow had lifted. But even in exile, Charles understood the weight of what he had inherited, not just a country at war, but a legacy of silence, betrayal, and whispered curses. The people remembered. In taverns and churches and muddy fields, stories spread. Not of the king's reforms or youthful glory, but of his unravelling, how he once claimed the gargoyles of Notre Dame spoke to him, how he refused to let mirrors near his chambers, how he screamed in the night that France has no skin. These were not royal tales, these were ghost stories, and Charles VI became a myth not of power, but of fragility. Isabeau, the queen who had once ruled in his name, lived long enough to see her children turned against each other. Her legacy, once bound to alliances and survival, became a cautionary tale. The woman who had tried to keep a kingdom stitched together with her husband, unravelling in the dark, now stood alone, vilified by one faction, forgotten by the other. And yet, in the art that followed, in the writings of courtiers and chroniclers, a strange reverence began to form around the memory of Charles VI, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps to rewrite the horror. They painted him again as Charles the Beloved, the gentle king, the innocent afflicted. They softened the madness, hid the blood, told stories of a tragic ruler brought low by illness, not fate. They preferred the myth. But the walls remembered. The halls of Hotel Saint-Paul, where he had burned his past into ash, stood silent for years, then were torn down brick by brick, as if the land itself wanted to forget. The tapestries were sold, the furniture stripped, even the gardens were razed, salt sown where roses once bloomed. In the years that followed, a girl from Domremy Jeanne, later known as Joan of Arc, would rise and claim to hear the voices of angels. She would say they told her to save France, to crown Charles VII, to drive out the English. But some wondered if her visions were born not of saints, but of what Charles VI had left behind, that perhaps madness runs not just in blood, but in soil. France would heal, slowly, with scars. But it would never forget that it had once been ruled by a man who mistook fire for salvation and silence for safety. A man who sat on a throne and saw demons in every corner. A man who did not die in one night, but piece by piece, until only a name remained. The name Charles VI lingers in the dust of history, not as a king, but as a question. How much madness can a crown endure before it breaks? He did not fall in battle. He was not betrayed by blade or poisoned cup. He was undone by the quiet rot inside the slow, cruel unmaking of a man who once held a nation in his hands and then forgot what hands were for. They called him the Beloved, perhaps out of hope or pity or the cruel poetry of irony. But what is love when it cannot recognize the beloved's face? What is loyalty when it fears the touch of a hand? Charles was not the tyrant they feared, nor the hero they needed. He was a mirror, and France, when it looked at him, saw its own fracture. His legacy was not a policy or a victory. It was a silence that stretched over decades, a silence filled with firelight and muttering and locked doors. Monarchs who followed ruled louder, harsher, with steel and law, but none cast a shadow so strange, so fragile. The boy king who once rode through Paris to thunderous cheers died a whisper. And yet perhaps there is something deeper here. In his madness, Charles saw things others denied. He spoke of demons and betrayal, of flames in the walls and snakes in the flesh. And perhaps in the fever of his mind he glimpsed truths no sane man dared name. France was bleeding, nobles were feeding on the corpse of unity. His throne was a mask, gilded and hollow. Perhaps he screamed because he saw too much. What history cannot decide is whether Charles was cursed or chosen to carry the burden of a dying order, chosen to be the final breath of a lineage already choking on its own grandeur. The madness of kings is never just personal, it is political, symbolic, infectious, and when a king loses himself, the world bends to accommodate the void. Today, Charles VI is little more than a footnote in textbooks, a curiosity, a tragic monarch. But that is the great trick of history. It forgets the horror, smooths the cracks, lights a candle where there once was fire. The palace where he wandered is gone, the court that feared him is dust. But somewhere in the stone of Paris there remains a whisper, a tremor, a memory too quiet to kill. The body was gone, but the echo of his scream never left the stone.